and mixed with Cold War international military and diplomatic issues. At the state level, state proclamations were made in the 1940s and into the early 50s, mostly by governors and state legislators, to enshrine this I'm an American Day kind of a concept in virtually every state. So it went state by state in the 40s. In turn, by 1949 and then 1952, almost every state had softened their language. They changed it to Citizenship Day. And in 1952, this finally went national and shifted to a firm date, September 17th, under a presidential proclamation for that Harry Truman did. As an act of Congress, then they pushed this forward in a new direction, and in 1953, under Dwight Eisenhower, he went to a whole week. He said, in the Cold War context, we need a week to celebrate the Constitution and really understand patriotism. So September 17th to 25th was the era of that. So I can keep going, but I won't. This remained throughout the whole rest of the century. Sort of debates about what to call this day. Is this an American Day? Is this a Constitution Day? Is this a Citizenship Day? And then actually Bill Clinton in 2000 issued a proclamation calling it Citizenship Day and Constitution Week. And we live in the present moment based on a 2004 amendment by Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia. He pushed Congress to rename the holiday Constitution Day and Citizenship Day and shortened it to Constitution Day in an amendment signed into law by George Bush in 2005. And this is why we're here, because we have to be, right? But more practically, because we want to be, right? Because we actually want to think through these sorts of issues. So lots of universities and colleges and federal institutions don't take it so seriously. They hand out copies of the Constitution or something like that and call it a day. We're here to really think deeply about this stuff. So our technical purpose, is recognizing and celebrating the origin and purposes of the Constitution, but there's more to it than that. And today we've selected a theme that we think has a lot of traction, the First Amendment, and in particular the hot button set of issues related to freedom of speech on campus, in the classroom, and in terms of activism as well as academic freedom, here at Oregon State and beyond it. And this is timed to coincide with a document that I hope all of you have, and we have some circulating around the room, a new OSU institutional statement on freedom. So please take a look at that. We'll be discussing that in some depth as we go, as well as the broader context of the political philosophy, the activism, the politics, and the context of these issues. It's incumbent on me as we start out to just quickly give us a sense of what this actually talks about. So the First Amendment to the Constitution literally states, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. All right, so what does this mean? In very short, before we get to our more deep analysis of this, the First Amendment guarantees freedoms concerning religion, expression, assembly, and the right to petition. It prohibits Congress from both promoting one religion over others and restricting an individual's religious practices. It guarantees freedom of expression by forbidding Congress from restricting the press or the rights of individuals to speak freely. And it also guarantees the right of citizens to assemble peaceably and to petition their government for redress of grievances and other kinds of concerns. But of course, this doesn't explain very much, right? It's all about the details and the interpretation. So what is free speech? What are the limits of speaking freely in terms of context or content, place? Should there be limits at all? Is there a difference between speaking to students in the classroom versus students on campus, faculty, staff, our published writing, our spoken word? What sorts of ways should we understand this as a community? Where do we disagree on freedom of speech and types of freedom of speech? And there's a lot of constitutional law on this, dividing it into roughly 3 types of speech. So we've got our hands full. And without further ado, I'll just introduce our speakers and see what they can do to help make sense of these complicated issues. First up, we've got Professor Andrew Valls. He's Associate Professor of Political Science here in the School of Public Policy and currently serves as Political Science Program Coordinator and is a specialist in political theory. He's written extensively on race and racism in contemporary society, as well as modern philosophy, ethics, and international affairs, and has an exciting new forthcoming book, David Hume on Morals. Is that the one? And others as well. So Andrew Valls is up first, but I'll introduce all of our panelists now so they can just stuff forward. Next up, we've got Vice Provost Susie Brubaker-Cole. She's Vice Provost for Student Affairs, a scholar of French literature, a fellow elected officer of our great new Phi Beta Kappa chapter here at OSU. In her position as Vice Provost, she's a key member of the executive leadership team here at OSU, working with the president and the cabinet, collaborating with others to develop and implement policies concerning students and general university programs. And so as the Vice Provost, she thus represents student services throughout the university, and she can talk about the construction of this document, as can our next speaker, who's the General Counsel, Gose, UC Berkeley Bolt Hall Law grad. She and the Office of the General Counsel, which she leads, work closely with many offices on campus and is engaged in a variety of legal activities on a daily basis, as you might imagine. She also participates in cabinet-level deliberations and recommendations to the president on policy issues before the university, including on these contentious issues of free speech. And finally, last but certainly not least, is Professor Joseph Orozco. He's associate professor in the philosophy faculty here at the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion, as well as president of the OSU chapter of the American Association of University Professors. He directs our Peace Studies program and also co-directs the Inaris Project for Alternative Futures. He's dedicated to a kind of engaged philosophy, which I deeply admire, and has written on political theory of various figures, including Josiah Royce, Jane Addams, Martin Luther King, Cesar Chavez, and he has a new book coming out in October called Toppling the Melting Pot. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Professor Valls.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. And also thank you for reading the text of the First Amendment, which I was going to do, but now it doesn't have to come out of my 10 minutes. And thank you all for coming. Despite what Chris says, we know that you don't have to be here. So appreciate the great turnout. So I want to just try in my few minutes to lay out what I see as the sort of intellectual terrain surrounding freedom of speech. As a way to open up the conversation to the other panelists and to you. Freedom of speech is, of course, both a moral political value and it's a constitutional value, and I want to say both something about both of those. So quite apart from the Constitution, there are lots of good reasons to support and defend freedom of speech. There are a lot of arguments about that out there. Two sort of broad categories of arguments for freedom of speech include what I would call democratic arguments and liberal arguments. So democratic arguments for freedom of speech see freedom of speech as a prerequisite for collective self-government and the need for citizens to be able to express their views and preferences, of course, is necessary for them to have meaningful input into governmental decisions, and a free press, of course, is essential to checking and limiting governmental power. So freedom of speech is important for all of those reasons. But from a sort of a liberal perspective, and by liberal here I mean sort of classical liberal, what we mean by the sort of the ideals of any free society, freedom of speech can be seen as an aspect of personal freedom or autonomy, as being within the range of action within which we don't have to account to others, or and no one else, including the government, has any right to interfere. So we've got lots of different kinds of arguments for freedom of speech, but let me just point out a few sort of wrinkles that complicate matters quite a bit. One is that freedom of speech is one value among many, and so the endorsement and enactment of freedom of speech cannot be unrestricted. It often has to be sort of set against and traded off against other kinds of values like public order, a fair trial, which sometimes interferes with unbridled freedom of speech, sometimes interferes with that. Equalizing citizen power in a democracy might require restrictions on freedom of speech, especially if you think that money is one form or manifestation of speech. And of course, protecting others from harm. But that raises another wrinkle, and that is the question of what is harm. Is mere offense something that might entitle us to restrict freedom of speech? John Stuart Mill, in his classic defense of freedom of speech on liberty, said that he thought that no kind of speech, mere speech, could not actually produce the kind of harm that would enable or entitle anyone to restrict it. But of course, there are hard cases with respect to this doctrine. Questions surrounding, for example, pornography and hate speech. So as I said, there are complex and sort of hard cases that, that sort of trouble any sort of simplistic endorsement of freedom of speech as a kind of a wide wide value. Finally, one other thing about freedom of speech, and that is the line between action and speech is not always so clear. For example, burning a flag is an act. It doesn't involve an utterance, and yet it generally falls under protected expression, according to Supreme Court doctrine. And similarly, certain kinds of speech are taken to be acts. And so that distinction, which is often relied on quite heavily, is actually a lot more complex than is often thought. So all of that is quite broad and general and independent of the Constitution, but of course within the Constitution, freedom of speech is upheld in the First Amendment. Interesting to note that originally, of course, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, were meant to apply only to the federal government and not to states. It's only been in the 20th century that the Supreme Court has applied them, those amendments, to the states. And for much of the history of this country, the Supreme Court actually did not take a very broad view of the protections of the First Amendment, particularly with regard to free speech. It's really only since the 1960s and 70s that Supreme Court doctrine has taken quite a dim view of restrictions on freedom of speech. And by now, those protections are quite expansive. But that's a fairly recent development in American constitutional law. The result is that today, compared to many other liberal democracies, the United States has much more of an absolutist understanding of freedom of speech. It's not absolute, of course, but it's much more towards that end of the spectrum than other liberal democracies. So, for example, in Germany, it's illegal to display a swastika or to deny the Holocaust. Those are restrictions that would never pass constitutional muster in the United States, for better or worse. So how does all of this play out in higher education? Well, freedom of speech, of course, has special importance in higher education. Fundamental to higher education is the exploration of ideas and the uninhibited expression of them. Ideas are to be tested against one another and against the evidence without any kind of prejudgment. And this, of course, applies to both faculty and students. And it applies to faculty both with respect to their role as researchers and with regard to their roles as teachers. And of course, students are expected to and hopefully encouraged to sort of follow the evidence and the arguments where they lead and to use their own judgment about where the truth lies. So a very close cousin to freedom of expression in the academic context is academic freedom, but they are not synonymous. They are not coextensive. Academic freedom is in some ways more complicated, in some ways more restricted than freedom of speech in general. Certainly there are things that I am not free to say as a professor, particularly in the classroom, which I would be perfectly free to say on the street corner. Furthermore, academic freedom is not just an individual freedom. It's actually first and foremost a freedom of the institution to govern itself. So it operates at the sort of institutional level as well as the individual level. That is, individual faculty members should be free to both, again, in their capacity as researchers and as teachers, to do their jobs as they see fit, to follow the evidence and the arguments where it leads them. But this can come into conflict with freedom of, or academic freedom as an institutional matter. There may be things that institutions try to do in order to achieve their freedom of expression, their academic freedom, that may conflict with how an individual faculty member sees his or her role. So academic freedom is a particularly complex matter that is certainly related to freedom of expression, but is not exactly the same thing. And given the different levels at which it operates, it can have conflict not only with other values, but also there can be tensions within our understanding of academic freedom itself. In terms of those tensions between academic freedom or freedom of speech on campus and other values. It seems to me that there is much to be concerned about. And what I want to emphasize here is that the tensions and the worries and the conflicts that often surround academic freedom on campus and freedom of speech on campus are conflicts among genuine values. They're conflicts among competing principles that somehow have to be traded off or balanced. They are not, at least not always, conflicts between freedom of speech on the one hand and simply illiberal or undemocratic or otherwise opprobrious views. So let me just cite two examples, one with respect to faculty and one with respect to students. From a sort of an external macro point of view, it's perfectly reasonable that, that society requires that universities, particularly public universities, give some account of what they are doing, how they are doing it, and present some evidence that they are actually accomplishing what they set out to accomplish. So there's been more and more in recent years emphasis on accountability, leading to things like assessment and things like this. Now this can often be the bane of our existence as individual faculty members as we write our learning outcomes and demonstrate that students are achieving them. But this is, I think, an example of a genuine conflict among reasonable and competing demands. My own personal view is that it's one thing to have faculty, to require faculty to write their own learning outcomes and to teach to them and to demonstrate that the students are actually achieving them. It's something quite different to have an institution dictating learning outcomes to the individual faculty member. But there too, there's room for reasonable disagreement, I think, because again, there's a genuine tension here between the kind of institutional imperatives and what may be required from the institutional point of view to achieve its academic freedom and the point of view of the individual faculty member. On the student side, of course, there's been a lot in the news in the last year about concerns about how people express themselves on campus, concerns about that often come under the headings of things like microaggressions and safe spaces and trigger warnings, demands for greater sensitivity in how people express themselves. Again, I want to emphasize that these concerns are often motivated by quite reasonable grievances, and I personally see these as kind of the growing pains of a society that's still struggling to overcome a legacy of some great injustices and inequalities. And yet, clearly there's some tension between these demands and freedom of speech, freedom of expression on campus. And so again, this is a genuine conflict, I think, all the more poignant because there are reasonable voices and reasonable points of view on both sides. So I don't think that there's an easy solution. I don't think that there's an answer to these conflicts, but I do think that there ought to be a way to resolve them in a way that sort of gives due credence to the concerns that are addressed. I'm not sure that there's a one-size-fits-all solution, but and maybe the best we can do is to muddle through. I'm not sure. Thank you.
In the last 6 months, Oregon State has developed the institutional statement on freedom of expression. I hope you all have a copy of it. If not, there's a web link, you can look it up there. That ultimately sets out to provide some clarity to some of the tensions and dynamics that Andrew identified. My plan in my 10 minutes is to give you a sense of some of the very specific dynamics that have given rise to this statement at OSU and similar statements at other universities around the country, to talk about the process and considerations that went into developing our OSU statement on freedom of expression, and to share what I view very briefly as some next steps for use in education around free speech to derive the true intended value from the statement. So to begin with, a couple of poignant examples of the dynamics around free speech on campuses across the country today. In the last year, a Midwestern university hosted or rather I should say a student organization at a Midwestern university hosted a speaker, a public event in a university auditorium. Now, this speaker was known for being somewhat incendiary in his opinions, and indeed, at one point during his talk, he commented on the concept of microaggressions, stating something to the effect of, these aggressions are so micro that they don't even really exist. There's nothing there. Now, at which point one student, followed by another student, followed by another student, went on stage with the speaker, and soon there was a group on stage such that the event could not proceed, and it was simply canceled on the spot. So discussion on the campus and in the press afterwards, and I'm going to, in each of these examples, name kind of the questions that came up without endorsing or any of the questions or responding to any of them. Should the speaker have been invited in the first place, given his reputation and what people knew some of the things would be that would come up in his talk? Was it hate speech? And if so, how should that hate speech be treated? Should the event have been canceled, or should it have proceeded? Should there be disciplinary consequences for the students who interrupted the event and claimed to be exercising their own free speech? And if so, on what grounds? Example number 2. On many campuses across the country, there has been what I'll call serial chalking, using the name of one of our presidential candidates, Donald Trump, and attached to that name some references to the wall at the US-Mexico border, and some other very negative viewpoints on people who identify as Muslim. There have been some comments that have been perceived, or chalkings I should say, that have been perceived as homophobic or racist. Now, people across the country, including on our campus, have taken various actions to negate these chalkings, crossing them out, erasing them, dumping water on them, or simply writing counter speech next to these. Questions that this is raised on campuses. Do any of these messages constitute a legitimate threat to populations on campus? Some student groups certainly have perceived them as threat. What happens when the chalkings are erased or defaced? Whose speech rights are being violated? Are speech rights being violated? Should colleges consider changing policy on use of sidewalks and public spaces with regard to free speech zones or protected speech? And finally, why are campuses not pursuing investigations more aggressively to determine responsibility for the chalkings? Again, not endorsing or answering any of these questions, and putting out what some of the conversation has been. Oh, and then the last I wanted to mention is, why are universities not punishing people who make hate speech? Now, that's a question that we've heard frequently from students across the country. And there's an interesting study done by a group at Yale that discovered, in surveying students at Yale, that 72% of the students surveyed favor disciplinary action against any student or faculty member on campus who uses language that is considered, and this is the language of the survey, racist, sexist, homophobic, or otherwise offensive. So at least on this one campus, we know that students generally favor some sort of consequences for those particular types of speech. Okay, I think that's enough example to get us going. And give a sense of what some of the questions are and issues that are being asked on campuses, our own and others across the country. What we observed amongst a group of leaders that I spoke with sometime middle of last year, in the responses to what many of us consider to be offensive speech, was a pretty broad lack of understanding amongst different populations on a college campus about what constitutes free speech in the context of a university, what counts as speech or expression, period, which Andrew referred to briefly, and what role the university can play in protecting or shutting down speech. So this led a group of leaders at the university, myself being one, to propose creating an institutional statement on freedom of expression. And that is the document that we've shared with you today, and is now on the OSU website. Now, I want to note that, as Andrew pointed out, there's a distinction between freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and academic freedom, and this document is intended not to address the academic freedom question as much as the question of freedom of speech. So I want to share with you the charge that we received from our provost at the time, Sabah Randawa. I chaired the task force, working group, whatever you want to call it, that produced this document. And he wrote to us, like many campuses nationally, OSU has recently experienced a number of incidents that raise questions about rights, responsibilities, and institutional positions regarding freedom of expression. The frequency with which these issues arise is likely to increase given the social and political climate of our day. And I think we can expect that to continue as we head into the peak of the election season. Several universities have recently created statements on freedom of expression, or what are called principles of intolerance at one university, to clarify institutional position, rights and responsibilities, and community expectations. And then he asked that this working group draft a statement that articulates OSU's commitment to freedom of expression with the goal of fostering broad understanding of the values of freedom of expression in a university community. And here's what I think is really probably most important in this charge, and that shows up in our statement as well. The statement should also promote understanding of the university's approach to responding to various speech acts in order to protect free expression, but also to exercise counter-speech as a means to reaffirm community values against acts of hatred and other intolerant conduct. And you will see that in number 6 in particular in the document we've created. Now, the membership of this task force included myself, graduate student from the College Student Services Administration Program, Freddie Leon. Becca Gose was a consultant to us. Kate Hullischok, who is the president of the Faculty Senate. Angela Batista, who is the interim chief diversity officer. Rachel Grisham, the ASOSU, I think she was president-elect at the time and is now president. Susan Shaw from CLA. Candace Baltz, who's the director of Orange Media Network, our student press on campus. Jeff Sherman from Open Campus and Extension, Mark Zabriskie from the College of Pharmacy, and Clay Simmons, who is the interim director of Equal Opportunity and Access and is the chief compliance officer for the university. So our process, very briefly, was to begin by looking at statements from a number of other universities. And there are quite a few across the country, and they're proliferating as we speak. I think the earliest one came from Yale University, and it was a rather large, thick document, as might have been expected from that university. And we decided that that model was far too dense, and at moments, I think the word over-thought out came out, but certainly served its purpose at Yale. And so we didn't want to follow that model. But we also looked at the University of Chicago's statement, which has been adopted or adapted by a number of other universities, included Duke University, Yale, I mentioned Illinois, Indiana, and then University of California, Berkeley statement, which was very interesting in that it was crafted in response to a very particular set of incidents around conflict in the Middle East and various opinions on campus regarding that conflict as it's playing out on their own campus. The resulting statement doesn't look exactly like any of those, but those were very important to our process. And it accomplishes a few key things. First, it recognizes the inherently fraught nature of free speech, and that it will inevitably raise strong emotions and feelings and probably conflict on our campus ongoing. Whether we have a statement or not, it's going to be fraught. Second, it asserts that disagreement and conflicting viewpoints are and absolutely should be an integral part of education, learning, and the intellectual discourse of any university campus. Third, the statement acknowledges that what many of us consider to be highly offensive speech is, in most cases, although not all, and I'll let Becca speak to those, protected under constitutional free speech. And that is hard to face sometimes, but it is protected speech in most cases.
Could you repeat that?
Certainly. The statement acknowledges that what many of us consider to be highly offensive speech is generally still protected under free speech. Fourth, the statement communicates an expectation of civility and respect, even in the most vehement moments of disagreement and conflict. And then fifth, as I mentioned earlier, the statement cites the limitations that the university can place on speech, meaning time, place, manner, and it cites the actual policy. And then finally, which I think is somewhat unique in our statement, I haven't seen it emphasized in this way in statements from other universities, and I'm very proud that this is a part of our statement. It makes it clear that the university may exercise counter-speech in accord with our values of equity and inclusion in our educational mission. So this is now on the university website, which is a good start to dissemination, and I'm thrilled with the turnout at this event today, and I'm really happy to see so many students and student leaders here. But the website is a more passive and kind of inadequate means of distribution, and I hope that we can have many more events to help spread awareness of this. But I'd like to end with a little wish list of what else we might do on campus to help propagate and expand understanding of our free speech principles. First, I'm very happy to announce that, I think it was just yesterday, I spoke with ASOSU leadership, And we are going to partner with ASOSU and hopefully with Orange Media Network to collaborate on some sort of campaign or initiative to help spread understandings of the importance of free speech and raise awareness of our institutional statement. So I think that will be very productive. I also, one of my roles is I'm sort of a scholar of higher education and reading nationally what's going on. And there was an excellent article published last year by 2 law faculty at UC Irvine who taught a freshman seminar on free speech. It was very revealing. And they note how today's students' political consciousness formed during a period, for the most part, when they have been very much exposed to and aware of the harms of bullying and the harms of hateful speech. But it is less true that our students today have been tuned into the social harms of censorship or punishment meted out for dissenting voices. For example, the authors note that students in their course were surprised to learn that people went to prison for criticizing the draft during the World War I period, and were surprised to learn that people were punished, blacklisted, etc., for espousing communist ideas during the 20s, 30s, and the McCarthy era. So I think that this is important, and I think this is a hard thing for many faculty in the instructional realm, but also professional staff to work with our students outside the classroom environment in understanding the values of free speech and the consequences of restricting or punishing speech. And so my hope is that while the institutional statement is a starting point, our collective goal as educators at OSU should be to create a campus climate where students have many opportunities how to learn and practice, how to oppose and contest other people's ideas, and can practice and refine how to articulate and defend their own values and beliefs. And to learn, and this is my closing statement, that often the best response to hateful or offensive speech is more speech, counter speech, and not silence. Thank you.
Hi there. So I am in a little bit of a different situation here at OSU because I'm actually one of the lawyers for the institution. So I do see some employees in the room, and when I'm talking with employees and providing legal advice, that's really what I'm doing. I'm providing legal advice, and it's attorney-client privilege. And I guess as the lawyer, I have to give a disclaimer now that here, what I'm doing here is not that. So obviously, I can only advise employees with kind of a legal advice. So this is not providing anyone legal advice. This is just sort of sharing with you sort of my understanding of the legal framework and how we approach things here at OSU generally. And frankly, a lot of what I was planning to say has really already been covered. So, I mean, I think it shows that we're all, these issues are being discussed, especially in recent years. And hopefully we can come to at least some conclusions here today that might be helpful for you going forward. So, in what I'll talk about, I really am focusing on kind of what the courts think and the legal framework, which of course is informed by the policy rationales that Dr. Valls and Dr. Brubaker-Cole have pointed out. But OSU is a state entity. So we are a slightly different state entity after some legislation a couple of years ago, but we are still the government. So the First Amendment only restricts the government. So I want to make that point clear. I think a lot of people think of free speech in a much broader context, but it really is a limitation and a restriction on the government. And OSU is the government for the purposes of the First Amendment. So that puts a lot of restrictions on OSU because of that. Additionally, we talked about the federal constitution. We have a state constitution here in Oregon that actually protects speech to a broader degree in many circumstances than even the federal constitution. And as a state entity, of course, we have to follow both of those. Dr. Valls went through some of the policy rationales behind the free speech clause. I'll summarize them briefly as 3 things and mention that I think people think really just one of them usually applies in the university context, but really all of them really apply. So the first is sort of a marketplace of ideas. The idea of the search for truth needs to be gained through unfettered discussion and conflict and a marketplace of ideas competing. And that is clearly one of the, that's the main rationale I think that people think applies at the university, and it certainly does. But the other 2 rationales really do apply here as well. The idea that it's really necessary for self-governance in a democracy, Obviously, with students on campus, that is a huge role of what the university is doing during the time that students are here, is helping to shape and guide future, well, current citizens, but our future, adult generations for years to come. And then the third being sort of individual autonomy from the government. As I mentioned, OSU is the government, and we are not just a school. We really are like a city in some ways, like a corporation in some ways, just in terms of the breadth of the institution. We have a lot of people living on campus, and people get their livelihoods in terms of working on campus. So the idea of autonomy from the government still is very much alive in terms of application to OSU. We've talked about what is speech or expression, and I'll just mention it is complicated, as others have said. But in general, the kinds of things that we see on campus that really do fall into the speech bucket are typically chalking, signs, banners, bulletin board postings, social media, notes, letters, emails, newspaper articles, etc. Those are what we think of mostly, I think, as speech. I think some people are surprised to hear sometimes that chalking or bulletin board postings or social media postings, websites, Facebook, that all counts under the free speech doctrine. Additionally, expressive conduct, so dancing, art, sit-ins, sign language, and other things really could be expressing a message. So then the question is, if we are a state entity and we are directed by the First Amendment and our state constitution to protect free speech and not restrict it, what can we do? What is protected speech? What is prohibited speech? And the first question we always get, and we've already talked about it a little bit here, is hate speech. And I think a lot of people think hate speech is illegal. It is not. In most cases, the most offensive speech you could imagine, we often, in most contexts, have to protect. So that is a really important thing to keep in mind. The Supreme Court has really protected a very expansive viewpoints, and it can be extremely offensive and can be extremely upsetting to all of us when we see this. So hate speech is speech we hate, but it's not illegal speech in most contexts. So then the next question we get is, we can't do anything? Are you kidding? I mean, we're sitting here trying to create this community of inclusion and having proactive diversity efforts and creating the safe spaces for students to feel safe and be healthy and learn and grow. And we can't do anything. Well, no, the answer is not we can't do anything. There's a difference between shutting down speech and other things we can do. And as Susie mentioned, our biggest tool is counter speech. Let me mention, before I get into kind of some of the framework, and this is a very complicated area of the law. I think Dr. Valls mentioned this. I won't get into a huge amount of detail, but I want to give you just a sense of what the framework is. But there is a clash of key values that happens on campuses, and is happening on campuses right now, because not only do we have legal obligations with regard to protecting free speech, we have legal obligations with regard to Title VI, Title VII, Title IX, Equal Protection Clause of both the state and federal constitutions. So we have, if we're talking legal obligations, there's often competing legal obligations. If you're talking general philosophical principles, as has already been discussed, there's often a clash of those. So the good news is the courts have been struggling with this for a while, so we do have some precedent and frameworks on how to manage this. I will also say where universities are getting themselves in trouble and historically have got themselves in trouble is in one of two situations. One is by shutting down the speech. In almost all contexts, that's where universities have gotten themselves into legal trouble or trouble in the press, reputational harm. The other end of the spectrum is when universities put their heads in the sand if something is happening that's truly contrary to the values of our institution. So those are the two, I would say, guideposts that we try to avoid at OSU strongly, to avoid either of those two pitfalls. So in terms of how courts look at free speech and how they analyze it, as you've heard, no right under the Constitution is absolute. There's always a variety of tests that apply. I will say in the free speech area, the tests really depend on where the speech is taking place. It's highly context specific, and often who is speaking as well. If they're speaking for an institution, if they're speaking for themselves in their private citizen capacity. And without getting into a lot of detail, I'll just note the couple buckets of places that courts sort of look at. So one is on the far end of the scale in terms of most protected speech, least ability for OSU to control anything, is the public forum. And the courts have said public forum can be, it's either something that is traditionally a public forum, a quad, a park, often some sidewalk streets. It can also be a forum that's created by the government for all comers. So if you have a bulletin board, for example, and you've opened it up to all comers, you've likely just created a public forum for yourself. So if you're in the public forum area, the only thing that the government, OSU, can restrict is time, place, and manner. So sort of the means and the method and the anti-disruption. It's not something that can be content discrimination or viewpoint discrimination, regardless of how abhorrent some of those views may be as they're being expressed in that quad. And then the next sort of level down in terms of least protected, most, more ability to control on the institution's part would be the non-public forum. So that's the classrooms, that's the labs. Those are spaces that have not been opened up for all comers. There still are free speech rights, of course, in those contexts, but they can be limited if they're reasonably related to the efficient operation and purposes of the forum. Let me stop here and mention academic freedom. We've been talking about that. As Dr. Valls said, academic freedom is very complex. I've studied it for a number of years, and the conclusion I've come to is that it kind of lives in a couple of places. It's either, or usually both, policy and contractual in terms of it's in the faculty handbooks, it's the faculty senate, principals, policies, it's a contractual right with the institution's professoriate, as well as sort of a policy right. And that really often applies in private universities as well. But I also see academic freedom as sort of the functional application of the First Amendment in a particular context, which is public employees. So the Supreme Court has a large history of looking at how public employee speech is going to be governed, because public employees typically get a lesser level of speech rights because they are often speaking for the institution or serving a particular mission within the institution. The Supreme Court has carved out the professoriate from the typical public employee speech doctrine because of academic freedom. And the lower courts aren't sure what to do with that yet. So in a recent case called Gose, not that recent, something maybe 5-6 years ago, the Supreme Court said, we're going to carve out academic freedom from these more stricter rules we're now putting on public employees. We're not telling you what to do with that yet, but we're carving it out. And now the lower courts are kind of splitting in deciding what we're going to do with that. I'm happy to say that in the Ninth Circuit, the federal circuit that governs where we are, academic freedom is protected at a higher level, absolutely. So we're in a good place here for academic freedom and where the courts are looking at public employee speech. But the way I look at it as a lawyer is academic freedom is a particular application of the First Amendment in a particular context. And it's also kind of a policy contractual issue. So, but it's all under that umbrella of non-public forum. So we talked about public forum. Now non-public forum is classrooms, labs, and such where the university can regulate if it's reasonably related to a legitimate goal, setting aside that academic freedom is part of our goals and part of our structure. And then the last two would be OSU-sponsored speech. So if it's a particular speech that OSU is sponsoring, or they've decided to sponsor an outside group or sponsor something that's, is happening on campus, that also can be regulated by OSU if it's reasonably related to a legitimate pedagogical purpose. On the farthest end of the spectrum, and this is where there is the least protection for kind of others, free speech rights, and the most ability to control on OSU's part, is OSU's own speech. And that is why OSU's counter speech is typically our biggest tool when we're facing these kind of conflicts on campus. I'll stop there. Just note that this is, of course, a very complicated area of the law, but what I've been really impressed with in my work here for years, actually, is that at least leadership and everyone I've worked with across campus is equally dedicated to all, the free speech concerns and principles that are important to guiding this institution, as well as our diversity, inclusion, and other values that might be at play in a particular conflict. And so I've been very proud to see the level of discourse that's happening at the leadership level and otherwise to kind of do our best to protect all of those values. Thank you.
So let me first begin by saying thank you to Professor Nichols for organizing this and getting this underway, It's always an honor to be able to serve and help with this particular forum that we've been doing many years now in the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion. And what I want to do, hopefully, is to be able to draw together some thoughts from my esteemed panel and sort of get us to have a broader conversation. But I do want to speak about, my remarks are going to be mostly around the question about freedom of expression and the demands of social justice on university campuses. And my remarks, in some sense, are informed by my experience of sort of teaching constitutional issues and philosophy of law for over 20 years. And also, and most pointedly in this presentation, as president of the OSU chapter of the American Association of University Professors. So for over 100 years, the AAUP has been the most prominent watchdog professional organization for academic freedom in the United States, started by one of my great heroes, John Dewey, an American philosopher. But we are an organization dedicated to trying to promote the interests of faculty of all ranks and to protect academic freedom from any sorts of threats in the university. Right, and so in this experience of teaching constitutional law with students and in forums with AAUP, I've sort of come to recognize that when we talk about freedom of expression, there's usually two ways, at least students, when they talk about this, sort of recognize it. And I want to distinguish freedom of expression as a legal right and freedom of expression as perhaps a social norm, or perhaps as what Professor Valls called a moral right. So when we talk about freedom of expression as a legal right, we're usually talking about, as we've been hearing about, rules and regulations that prohibit state agencies from arbitrarily or unreasonably restricting the freedom of expression of citizens. Now, of course, as we've also heard, this doesn't necessarily mean that there can be no restrictions on speech, right? So the Supreme Court in its case law has established that state agencies may be able to put restrictions that limit the time, place, and manner on which speech can be restricted. And this can sometimes seem to be a little bit odd and unreasonable about how these restrictions go, but these are allowable. Like, for instance, in 2004, for the Republican National Convention, the city that the convention was in created free speech zones to allow protesters to be able to confront the delegates at the Republican National Convention. Some of these free speech zones, however, were about 2 blocks away from the convention center behind barbed wire and with large blockades. And so realistically, there was no way in which any of the delegates would be able to hear the speech of people, but this is considered to be allowing people to have their freedom of expression, right? You can sort of say what you want, but it may be a block, 2 blocks, a mile away from the actual people that perhaps you were trying to address your grievances toward. And that's allowable according to the Supreme Court. Right, so the only restrictions that the Supreme Court has allowed on speech in most cases, right, are about looking at the content of speech. And the Supreme Court has said that there can be almost no restriction on the content of an individual's speech, except for that speech which may incite immediate unlawful action, right? So if there is speech that somehow is goading people to commit a crime in an immediate sense, like let's go right now and burn down the courthouse building, that kind of speech can be restricted. But as we've heard, right, if you start saying all sorts of hateful things about whatever marginalized group in town, the Supreme Court has said that is not restrictable, right? That is allowable. So hate speech is protected speech under the First Amendment according to Supreme Court case law. Now, so that's, I think, talking about free speech or freedom of expression as a legal right, right? My students sometimes also think that free speech has a kind of a social norm dimension. And what I mean by this is that people usually take free speech to involve both a right and a duty, right? So the idea that individuals have some right to be able to say whatever they want, whenever they want, and to express their opinion freely. And that right then creates a duty on the part of other citizens around them to be able to respect that opinion. And so that usually means, when we say respect that opinion, means to let it stand, to tolerate the expression no matter what. Some of my students sometimes say when they come into my class, and hopefully not when they leave it, but they say at the beginning, well, when I have freedom of expression, I get to say whatever I want, and no one can say anything about it, no one can criticize me for it, because my freedom of speech means I'm immune to criticism, right? And so I see this all the time in class. classes. And I think that this is a widespread view amongst many people, right, that there's a sort of social norm dimension to this, is that my right to free speech creates various kinds of obligations on you to simply just take it and listen to me. So tied up here is the idea that the right to free speech creates a duty to others to tolerate, respect, or be civil to someone in the expression of their speech. And in fact, you see civility put into the statement of policy here at OSU. Now, the national AAUP has expressed concern with the possibility of conflating the meanings of free speech as a legal right and as a social norm, especially in regard to the idea of civility in academic settings. It has opposed the move to make civility or collegiality as a standard for job performance evaluation of faculty and staff. Now, in opposing the idea of civility as a value in statements like this or in legal contracts with employees, it's not because the AAUP hates civility. It's not that we don't like people to be nice to each other. The problem is because civility as a term is very vague and undefined. And it's often very culturally conditioned. It's very subjective about what it means to be civil to one another. As such, right, with civility used as a standard for community interaction or for a job performance can be used as a disciplinary tool by supervisors and administrators to punish faculty and staff, and particularly women or people of color who may not fit certain stereotypical roles in the academic university and who may be thought to be uppity or to be speaking out of turn. So the stand of the AAUP is that focusing on civility and respect and so forth puts focus on the manner in which something is expressed rather than in the content of what is being said by people. And I think that this approach that the AAUP takes is that we need to focus not on how things are said, but what people are saying, sort of conditions a lot of the way in which the AAUP understands freedom of expression on a wide variety of issues. And so I want to talk about the demands of social justice and how the AAUP might sort of approach these kinds of things. Right, and so in the past year, as we've heard, universities have, across the nation, including OSU, have experienced a wave of student protests that have prodded faculty and administrators to think about how the university should balance freedom of expression with the demands of social justice and the protection of marginalized communities in the United States. This summer has been filled with news about the University of Chicago Dean of Students, John Ellison, who wrote a letter to incoming first-year students expressing a certain opinion about how they should expect life to be at the University of Chicago. And so he wrote to the incoming freshmen that as a university, right, this is the sort of university stand, that students should not expect going to the University of Chicago expecting trigger warnings from their classes. They should expect that the University of Chicago is not the kind of place like DePaul University, so to speak, that will cancel speakers because they might possibly say offensive things. And that the University of Chicago does not support the idea of something called an intellectual safe space on campus. What's interesting is just this Tuesday, a second letter was produced by about 150 faculty members of the University of Chicago saying that foreclosing discussion about the legitimacy of things like trigger warnings and safe spaces and so forth is contrary to the spirit of academic freedom and democracy, and encourage students to push back against the dean of students and to continue the conversation going on. So this is a highly contested issue that puts together many different, puts at odds many different constituencies on the university, the administration versus the faculty versus the students, and many different alliances and coalitions can be formed around this issue. So it's very timely that we talk about this. Now, let me just say a little bit about how the national AAUP looks upon this question about trigger warnings and safe spaces and so forth. Now, in saying this about the national AAUP, this does not reflect necessarily the views of the OSU AAUP. We haven't actually made any sort of policy statements about this. But in 2014, the national AAUP did a study and a report about the use of trigger warnings in academia. And so for those of you who have never heard this term, right, a trigger warning is the idea that in presenting certain kinds of material in the classroom, a professor might want to indicate that there are certain kinds of material which will be controversial or that may trigger people who have suffered some sort of trauma or who may be particularly sensitive to expressions of racism, homophobia, transphobia, etc. and that students deserve to have a trigger warning that these kinds of highly controversial or offensive material may be brought up into the discussion of the classroom. And so there's been a lot of discussion by students, and particularly in many places, that they would like to have some kind of trigger warning placed on controversial material that may bring up, for instance, certain kinds of feelings. And the idea here is that the proponents of trigger warnings say that trigger warnings allow people perhaps who have experienced various forms of trauma, say for instance sexual assault or rape, that if something is going to discuss that or certain kinds of personal violence are going to be discussed in class, that they want to be able to have a warning beforehand so that they can prepare for the discussion before it comes up, rather than it sort of arise in the middle of the discussion and then they are triggered or experience various kinds of feelings and sensitivities that do not allow them to participate fully in the conversation. The National AAUP position on this follows reasoning on the position on civility. Right? Again, the idea here is that civility is probably not a good value to have in any kind of statement or policy just because it's vague. AAUP is concerned about trigger warnings and the idea of safe spaces as policies in terms of them being mandated by the university. Right? So AAUP is opposed to the idea of trigger warnings as something that the university would mandate faculty have to do. Right, and the concern here is that the discussion of trigger warnings and safe spaces will be codified into academic regulations. And the worry of AAUP here is always that with using vague and undefined terms like civility or trigger warning or safe space, is that these kinds of terms can often be used arbitrarily and unreasonably by administrators and supervisors to discipline people and to force them to do things that would be contrary to their individual freedom or their academic freedom or just good sense. Right, and so rather than using vague or undefined terms, we should, the AAUP says we should try to pursue social justice for real. The worry about these kinds of mandated policies is that AAUP feels that sometimes universities try to pursue social justice on the cheap. That is, that they try to create these policies about trigger warnings or civility or freedom of expression in various kinds of ways to sort of cover their legal obligations. But they don't necessarily make a really deep kinds of commitments, which would usually mean restructuring the economic and the institutional makeup of the university to address concerns about economic and social inequalities. Right, and so the concern is that we should be wary about these kinds of demands of social justice being institutionalized, because very often they're used as substitutes rather than for making substantive and structural changes to the university to address these kinds of historical inequities. So let me just close this up and then we can have a discussion. There are important debates to have about this, and I think that universities need to create spaces to discuss this, and I'm confident that we will have many different kind of conversations in the next academic year about these issues. I think students should be encouraged to protest and to push against administrators and faculty. I think counter speech, in fact, is a good thing. And to my sort of personal view to talk to students about this would be to say, be creative about what you can do in terms of speech. It doesn't necessarily have to be getting up on stage and prohibiting a speaker from talking. One of the most effective sort of forms of speech that I saw most recently was at UC Irvine, shortly after, this was during the Occupy movement protest, and there was a student protest there in which the Provost, I believe at the time, the chancellor called in the police, and then there were many students who were pepper sprayed, and there was this famous sort of image of the police pepper spraying students who were in a peaceful protest. The response to that by students was to shadow the chancellor from her office to her car. And what they did was, it was a silent protest, no speech was said, but it was in action. Hundreds of students showed up and they created a gauntlet from the office door of the chancellor to her car and stood in silent protest as witness, letting her know that they were objected to the idea of her calling in the police on student protest. In fact, there's, as my capacity as a peace studies advisor, right, that there are many different ways in which people have been talking about how to create protests. In fact, the theorist Gene Sharp has documented over 200 ways of doing non-violent protest. I think it bears some study for students who are interested in the demands of social justice to study those and to figure out the ways in which counter-speech can take place on campus. At the same time, we need to consider how to continue to make universities more inclusive. We need to be better aware of the diverse experiences and learning styles of our students. and how we can best accommodate them to see to their success. We also need to realize that the university needs to allow many different kinds of talking spaces to flourish. Not all conversations need to be intellectual debates and dialogues dedicated to achieving a rational consensus amongst speakers, right? So not every conversation has to be a marketplace of ideas in which we allow everything and everyone to speak. We sometimes have this ideal in our classrooms, but this is controversial too. I remember the discussions around Mary Daly at Boston College back in the 1970s. She was a radical feminist theorist who would not allow men into her classrooms because she wanted to create a safe space for women to be able to discuss these ideas without the interferences of male perspectives. Right? So our classrooms typically are protected spaces in which we have to allow a wide variety of people to speak, even to say perhaps some offensive things, as long as they don't violate the inclusivity demands of the university. But that doesn't mean that, right, the model for conversations in the classroom have to be every conversation on campus. And so, for instance, here on campus at OSU, when we had the large speak out in November of last year, the students wanted to create that as a safe space, meaning that they wanted to privilege the perspectives of students of color in talking about racism on campus. And now there was a huge backlash against this because many students were saying that's racist. If a white student wants to be able to get up and speak, they should be allowed. And so that might be perfectly acceptable as a norm for our classrooms. But right, our classrooms aren't the only kinds of conversations that we can have. And so we should try to figure out how we can create as many different spaces, including spaces in which the restriction on people being able to come into that conversation can take place. And we should have conversations that are rational, consensus seeking, but also we should create spaces for ones that can be emotional, ones that can be angry, and ones that can have joyful affirmation of our solidarities together as oppressed or marginalized people. Our classrooms may not necessarily always be the place for these expressions, but there should be many different kinds of places in which we learn and grow on campus. And likewise, we have to realize too that some speech can have the effect of undermining the conditions for which people are able to participate on campus. So the question about the Trump chalkings. This is a controversial issue, but what I have seen in some of my students, I had a student come and talk to me last year when some of these chalkings were taking place, and she was deeply hurt by some of this, and it did in fact make a big difference in her life emotionally to see people promoting this kind of perspective of the positions of Trump. She was a Mexican-American student, and she felt that what the Trump campaign represents to her is a message that she is not a welcome person here in the United States or at the university. So we need to recognize that speech that may be protected, right, constitutionally can have the effect of undermining the confidence of a person to be able to participate in the life of the university and to be able to participate in these rational conversations that we want to have. So we need to make sure that we understand that we are more than just simply minds in a vat or in a classroom, right? But we are also emotional creatures that have a variety of different needs and abilities, and to try to figure out how we can structure the university in the best way possible to welcome and be inclusive of all of the perspectives of all these different kinds of folks. And that will be a lot of work. So thank you.